Welcome to the Jan Broberg Show. My guest, Claude L. King, volunteers his experience as to whether a pedophile has ever admitted guilt and asked for help, and we discuss if we should change the term pedophile to minor attraction. Claude is a licensed clinical professional counselor and works with on-site employee counseling and education. He has worked with both victims and perpetrators. I am so excited to share our conversation. Here's Claude. All right, I'm very excited to welcome Claude L. King, LCPC, to our podcast. Tell us what LCPC stands for and welcome aboard, Claude.
Well, first of all, Jan, thank you for having me today. LCPC stands for Licensed Clinical Professional Counselor. So each state has its own kind of licensing board. So for the state of Illinois, you have to pass one test, which is the LPC test, and you have a license to practice, but you still have to be supervised, for a certain amount of time. And then once you pass the second licensing test, which is the LCPC, then you can practice independently without any supervision.
Oh, I love that. Okay, great to know. I found that it was interesting. I had never heard of, or at least I didn't understand what an employee assistance consultant was. And you were starting to tell me, and I'm like, wait, we'll put it on the podcast because I wanted people to hear about some of your experience around being that kind of a consultant in the Chicagoland area, Chicago area. Can you tell us a little bit about what you did as that and explain what that is to our audience?
Yeah, so employee assistant consultant is essentially a program that some employers provide, typically like bigger companies, to help support the mental health and well-being of their employees. The particular site that I work at is a call center. It's Discover Financial Services has a call center that just opened up on the south side of Chicago. And for those of you who have worked in a call center, you know how stressful of an environment that can be. You're on the phone all day, you're dealing with difficult customers, and that can lead to employee burnout. So I'm essentially there to provide on-site counseling for employees if they're experiencing stress related to work or outside of work, anxiety, depression, trauma, any type of mental health issue that's impacting their work performance. I'm there to provide on-site counseling. In addition to that, I provide crisis intervention. There's been times where there's been a death of an employee on site or a family member that caused the on-site crisis, and I help lead that crisis de-escalation process. And the last thing I do is I provide on-site workshops and trainings related to different mental health and wellness topics. So just this past month, I did a training on how exercise can boost your mental health. I've done trainings on positive parenting, on domestic violence, on work-life balance, on how to implement self-care strategies throughout your daily routine, just so I can help support the needs of the employees there. So it's a really great benefit that a lot of employers are starting to implement. And in addition to that, the last thing I'll say is they also offer 7 free therapy sessions for employees. So if they want to meet with a therapist in the community, their first 7 sessions are completely covered. They don't have to pay a copay or any out-of-pocket costs. So it's a really great benefit.
Wow, that's amazing. I feel like if we could implement that in almost every workplace, I mean, it would just fill a variety of needs for the employer, because people that are mentally healthy are going to be better at their jobs, right? They're going to just
Absolutely.
be able to do stressful jobs even better. And I'm really impressed that there is some movement towards doing that in more and more employee related. The relationship between the employer and employee has more of a focus on mental health, because often we're looking for health benefits, but if it doesn't include mental health, then sometimes we really do fall short. And we know that if we're mentally healthy, we're going to be better employees. We're going to miss less days of work. It's just going to be a better situation for everyone all the way around. I love that you do that. So in these 13 years that you have been in the mental health field, I know that you've specialized in working with teens, with young people, professionals, of course, the working professionals like you were just talking about, and that work-life balance. So when you talk about employee mental health related to their job, how often is that also related to what's going on at home or in their personal life, their own healing journey? How often would you say that you run up against that? Like, oh, I just figured out I got to heal from something, or I've experienced some trauma in my personal life. It didn't have anything to do with work, but it's affecting work. Can you talk to that?
Hmm. Yeah, I would say that's a majority of the time. There is always some connection between how you're functioning at work and what's going on at home. A lot of the area that I work in, that community is a underserved community. It's in the south side of Chicago. A really great thing about Discover Financial Services is they wanted to create this call center, which is not typical of big corporations like that, in a underserved community to help increase access to, well-paying jobs and these type of really great benefits that they provide. So a lot of the employees there have been impacted by community violence, domestic violence, are experiencing significant financial strain, having a hard time, paying for rent and other
Mm.
bills. It's a lot of single mothers that are in the community as well. And when they're coming into work, it's like they're trying really hard to compartmentalize everything that's going on at home, but sometimes it will come up, at work. If you had a difficult conversation with a customer who's, berating you over the phone or just accusing you of not providing really great customer service, and you try your best to try to compartmentalize that and try to regulate yourself, but then you have those days where it's just hard to hold that in, and you get really irritable. You might come off with a certain tone on the phone. I've had some clients, some employees that I work with had anxiety attacks while they're on the phone because of the stress of the work environment,
Mm.
and stuff that's going on in their personal life. So I would say a majority of the time it is related to personal issues that are going on at home, especially like childhood trauma that they never had an opportunity to address. Because a lot of times when you experience this type of trauma early in your life and you don't have access to the resources to get the help that you need, you just suppress it and you just keep moving forward with life, and then it can show up and manifest in other areas of your life, like your personal relationships or your work relationships.
Which I think is really an important topic where people can go, "Oh my gosh, I didn't really know where to go. I
Hmm.
didn't have resources to go somewhere, or I didn't even have the knowledge that I needed to look at what happened to me as a child or a tween or a teen. And now I'm in this workforce and it's stressful, and all of a sudden somebody's yelling at me on the phone, and it brings
Hmm.
up maybe not a direct memory, but it could totally trigger actual memories from some sort of violence or abuse in the past. And I really believe that in a lot of underserved communities, especially that do not have access to resources, that I just feel like the cycle of abuse, it can only be interrupted if we get to the healing of,
Hmm.
the parents, the adults. They have to get their healing so that the trauma isn't passed on to the next generation. And if you don't
Absolutely.
have resources and you don't even know where to go. I mean, I lived in a part of LA, and and felt completely at home, but I realized pretty early on, like, where do these neighbors of mine, where have they been going to get groceries? I mean, it was
Hmm.
so interesting to me that I didn't even realize it. But I was like, there's no grocery store, let
Hmm.
alone like a resource to a therapist or,
Hmm.
something like that, or to some other kind of, healing modality. I was like, wow, they they really need a grocery store in this area. And I
Right.
thought, isn't that funny that for me, it's like, how do you live in a neighborhood where there's not a grocery store? One of my best friends, she was a single mom, and she didn't have a car. She didn't drive. She didn't even have a license. And I was like, how do you go get groceries? I'd
Hmm.
take her sometimes when I could just, I ride the bus. I take my little guy with me and we go from this and that. And I just was like, the nearest grocery store was like 10 miles away. It was horrible. So
Right.
I think about the fact that even our physical needs are sometimes not met in communities. And so trying to get to the mental health is like it feels like icing on the cake, but to me, it's like the most important ingredient.
Oh, you hit the nail right on the head too, because that's exactly what's going on in some of the communities. It's like when you think about the hierarchy of needs, if you're living in a food desert or you don't have reliable transportation, you know, just think about
Mhm,
what all of the hoops that you have to jump through just to get access to like good healthy food or just to get access to healthcare, because a lot of times when people are experiencing chronic mental health, chronic stress over the period of several years, it actually can impact your physical health too. And if you don't have access to like healthcare professionals or doctors, and that's what your priority is. And it's like mental health. It's like, I'll get to it when I
mhm,
get to it. Like, I'm trying to take care of my basic needs, food, shelter, my physical health. And a lot of times what happens is the mental health is not something that people prioritize until, they have a panic attack or they're experiencing depression or suicidal thoughts, or they have to check themselves into a hospital because of
mhm.
burnout. And that's the reality of a lot of the people that I work with.
Yeah, really interesting how that correlates with abuse and sexual abuse, that you have had extensive work with teens and even adults. I know that having had that experience, you must have some, personal stories, and without divulging anything that would be, proprietary and private, could you speak to some of your, some of the things that you have seen in the area of mental health, and how your work is impacting that change that is so needed in our communities everywhere?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just a little bit of background. I first got exposed to working with both victims and perpetrators of sexual abuse when I was working for the Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Chicago. I did my internship while I was there in grad school. And then the Catholic Charities had a specialization in working with people who had been impacted by abuse and neglect, but specifically sexual abuse. So as an intern, that was my first exposure with it. But it wasn't until I became a full-time employee there a couple years afterwards that I really kind of like dove deep into that work. A lot of times what would happen is we would get referrals from another organization that we partnered with, which were essentially like the first responders. So if there was a child that was being
Mm,
sexually abused or physically abused, there would be a hotline call that would be made. The kids would be removed from the household, and then they would go through a clinical interview where the interviewer would ask the child questions or teenager questions about what they experienced, just trying to get the facts about what happened. And then based off of that information, then they would refer that client to speak to a therapist, which was usually me. And my role was
mhm.
to help them reintegrate the trauma. And that looked different compared it looked different depending on like what age group I was working with. For the really young children that
Right.
were 4, 5, 6 years old, that might not have had the verbal or communication skills to really identify how they felt or what they really experienced, we would have to use a lot of non-directive interventions like sand tray therapy, role playing, art therapy, just different modalities just to get them to express what that experience was and how it impacted them. And based off of the different things that would come up during those sessions, I would be able to intervene, be able to speak to some of those things like that wasn't your fault, or the people that you were supposed to be able to trust that were supposed to keep you safe, they weren't able to do that. And you did what you needed to do in that moment to survive, and just helping to reframe some of the negative beliefs that they had about themselves as a result. I remember one particular client. He was 9 years old and he had two younger siblings that were 6 and 7. And he had sexually abused his younger sisters. And they were removed from their mother's care and placed in different foster care placements. And he had a lot of shame and guilt that he
Mm,
was dealing with because he felt he was responsible for breaking up his family. And you could tell he was very apologetic about it. But the thing that wasn't being acknowledged or recognized was the fact that he was a victim of sexual abuse as well. He had a older cousin who was like 13 or 14 years old, who was exposing him to pornography, who had sexually abused him. His mom was a single mom, so she was trying to meet the basic needs of her children. A lot of times, she was leaving her children unsupervised at home for long periods of time. So that led him to be susceptible to having family members that were going through their own mental health issues, watching them and exposing him to sexual images that he should not have been exposed to. And because he didn't get treatment for that, he ended up reenacting that sexual abuse onto his younger siblings, not knowing that that wasn't a good thing to do. So a lot of the work that I did with
Right.
him was just helping him to recognize that he was a victim as well, that he was exposed to sexual images and videos that helped that made him have a incorrect view of what a sexual relationship looks like, um, and just helping him have some compassion for himself, being able to forgive himself, teaching him healthy boundaries like good touches, bad touches, teaching him about consent, and eventually he got to a point where he was able to apologize for his sisters, and they were able to be returned to their household. So it ended up being a really great ending to um, a difficult situation, but unfortunately, that's not always the reality in a lot of the cases that I worked with.
So that is a story with a happy ending, because I know so many stories don't end there. And it's really interesting to hear you talk about, because I think so often boys and men don't talk about their own sexual abuse, and probably even the older 13, 14-year-old cousin had some kind of abuse, because it seems to just
Absolutely.
pass itself down. And most, even teenagers who are starting to go through puberty and all those things that, their bodies are changing.
Hmm.
They don't necessarily perpetrate because they are just curious. They usually perpetrate because something happened to them.
Hmm.
I don't know if that's always true. Maybe you could speak a little bit more about boys and men in this regard as to why don't they talk about it as much. I mean, I kind of have my own ideas, but I'd love to hear it from you, from, a counselor that has the training, that has worked a lot with both the perpetrators and the victims, and to see from your point of view how men and boys, um, you know, is there anything we could do to help them talk more often, I guess, because
Hmm.
it impacts their lives so much. And the pornography is something that starts that whole kind of slippery slope, I guess. And yet we joke about it
Hmm.
on every talk show at night, on everywhere. It's always, oh, porn this, porn that. And I'm like, yeah, there's a real problem there that at least I see. I'd like to
Hmm.
hear it from your point of view about how it impacts, young boys and men, and how we get them to start talking about it.
Yeah. Well, to address the first thing that you said, I think a lot of times it can be curiosity. As you mentioned, boys, you're going through puberty, hormones are racing, and they're very curious about their bodies. And sometimes they don't get the education they need around sex and sexuality and consent, because a lot of times parents are not aware that they're experiencing these things, or a lot of parents don't even feel comfortable having these conversations. So a lot of times what young boys do is
Mhm.
they'll hear things that their friends say, or they'll watch porn and like try to educate themselves on like how to have sex that way. And we know that porn is not a realistic depiction of sex, and it's for entertainment value. So a lot of boys are getting kind of incorrect images just surrounding sex and sexuality in general. And then some boys have been actually sexually abused, and then they reenact that abuse onto somebody else. But in particular, to your question, there's a lot of um, society does not promote expression of young boys, where boys are socialized from a very young age to not be vulnerable, not share how they feel. If they are having any type of difficult experience, we've been socialized just to hold it in, to suppress it, to internalize it, to be strong. And unfortunately, boys grow up feeling like they don't have spaces where they can be comfortable being safe and express how they feel and receive support for that. So then when we have experiences like being sexually abused at a young age, we just try to suppress it, compartmentalize it, and just keep moving forward with life. And sometimes that can be helpful for that point in time if you don't have a person to talk to, you don't have access to a therapist or a support group, but eventually it's going to catch up with you later in life. You're going to start to become, angry and irritable. You're going to have a hard time having close, intimate relationships with people. You're going to be skeptical of people's intentions, worried about being taken advantage of. It can lead to a life of confused sexual identity. That's something a lot of men that I've worked with have expressed, that because of this sexual experience that they had, that they did not consent to when they were younger, they were confused about their sexual orientation for a majority of their life. And it can really just cause your life to pivot in a really different direction because of that. And then there's just a lot of shame and guilt surrounding that, especially being a male. It's like, because as a man, you're supposed to be able to protect yourself. You're supposed to be able to, escape or fight whatever is happening to you in that moment. So a lot of men start to question their masculinity or their ability to be a protector. And one of the things that I try to communicate to men that have experienced that is just to reassure them that what they experienced was not their fault. There were people that they entrusted early in their life that were supposed to protect them, that did not. There were people that they may have expressed their abuse to, whether it was their mom, their dad, or other family members, that did not either believe them or blame them for the sexual abuse that they experienced, felt like it was their fault in some way. You asked for it, or I told you not to do that and you did, and this is the result of that. So it's like when the people that are closest to you react to you in that way, it's like, what other choice do you have but to try to internalize it and just move forward? So just giving them reassurance that, it wasn't their fault. The people that were in their life were supposed to protect them did not. But there is hope. You can heal from this. And the way that you do that is by talking about what you experience. So we can reprocess those experiences. We can replace some of those negative self-beliefs about yourself, that you're not worthy, you're not lovable, you're not, you deserve this, with something that's more affirming, so they can finally heal from the abuse that they experience.
So you're talking about how, men and boys and really everyone that has experienced sexual abuse and assault, sexual violence can heal.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts by talking about it. And I really, really am curious, like when you see, a young person, a teen or a child that has suppressed because, like you said, they have to go on with life and they don't have resources. They may not even know how to ask for them. And then if they're not supported, like
Right.
believed, I think is the number one thing that if a parent listening to this, particular podcast could just do that one thing for your children, just believe them and don't blame them, because
Mm-hmm.
what happened to them really wasn't their fault. Even if they went against your wishes and went to the party anyway, even if they wore a shorter skirt or they, whatever it was, they had a drink and they're underage or whatever the things were, they still are not the reason. None of that, the blame or the shame or the guilty party is not your child.
Right.
It's the other person that did this to them. And most children and young people don't even have the capacity to give consent, nor do they know what that even means, really. They don't
Mm-hmm.
have, how your brain isn't developed, right? And you
Right.
don't
Right.
even have the ability to, like, look at the situation and go, how is this going to affect me? And they're too afraid, they freeze. I just really like the idea that if they can't find support from, that single mom or their parents or their friends or somebody that they can trust at their church or their community center or somewhere, then they're not going to talk about it, and they're not
Mm-hmm.
going to be able to process it. Like you said,
Mm-hmm.
people need to talk about it so that they can, what did you call it? Reformulate, you said something.
Reintegrate the trauma, right? Because what happens when people experience
So when you
any type
talk
of
about that,
trauma, especially sexual abuse, is your prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of your brain, it goes offline, it shuts off. And because it overwhelms the body's ability to cope. But your body is still experiencing this trauma. So it's not being integrated into your full experience. And that's why a lot of people can't recall parts of the trauma that they experienced because they weren't fully present. They had dissociated for parts of it. So one of the things that trauma informed care does
and that's
is
a protection in some ways, right?
absolutely, absolutely. So one of the things that trauma informed care does, or EMDR, which I do as well, is it takes those repressed memories that are not conscious, and it brings them to the present, so you can actually start to deal with it, because you can't deal with something that you can't remember. And that's what happens a lot of times with trauma. Your body is still having a physical reaction. Your heart is racing when you get triggered. You become tense. You start to dissociate, but you don't really understand where this is coming from. It's because of some memory that you had to suppress. So that's what trauma work is geared to do.
Yeah. Okay, so that leads me to the next question. When you are working with a young person, and let's say they did have access to the resource, to you, to
Mm-hmm.
EMDR therapy, to several things, but they're only 9 years old, like the boy you talked about. 9 years old, how much can they process if they do remember and they can have access at that point? And then what happens a few years down the road or 10 years down the road? What what is the kind of the prognosis of what's going to happen when they're older, when they now go through puberty, when now they're young adults and getting into relationships and all of that? I know you said sexuality, that was a hard one
Mm-hmm.
to sometimes understand and know because of what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about what happens if they did have some good therapy at that point, and then what? How many years
Yeah.
later are we looking to continue that process?
Yeah, it really depends on the individual, the severity of the trauma they experience. Some people, it might be just a one-time thing. Some people could be chronic trauma they experience for majority of their childhood. The prognosis, in my experience, really depends on the level of support that they have, moving forward. So if they have, and a lot of trauma work, I think it's important to acknowledge this, a lot of trauma work, you have to involve the family in it in some capacity, the people that are going to be those primary caregivers for the child, because very often the trauma is not just central to the child, but it's something that has affected the whole family, and a lot of it has been generational. It's not something that just started, with this specific generation. It's something that's been going on. Abuse, neglect has been going on for generations, and this is just the manifestation of that systemic issue. So a lot of times, family work is very essential. Being able to bring different family members into these conversations and talk about how do you support this young person in their healing journey, whether that means providing a safe space for them to talk about anything that might come up if they become triggered, if they're having some difficult feelings that they need to express, creating a safe space for them to just express that and just listen, whether that means, giving that young person some reassurance, or letting them know that it wasn't their fault, or that I'm just here for you at the very bare minimum. I'm just here for you if you need me. Or if that means that adult or primary care provider needs to apologize for whether how they've dropped the ball in some instances. So like having a good support system in place, I think will lead to a really healthy prognosis for that individual. And then one thing I want to say as well is sometimes that young person might go through therapy for a period of years and they get to a place where they're pretty stable and they can discontinue therapy, they could be successfully discharged. And then later in life, they might go through a developmental stage, puberty, or young adult, or they become a parent for the first time, and that trauma could be re-triggered, and it can evoke some of those strong feelings again. It's like, wow, I thought I healed from this. I thought I've overcame this, and now it's coming up again because of different life changes that are happening. And then that's a perfect opportunity to revisit going back to therapy and like working through some of those emotions that are coming up. So it can be a lifelong journey for some people. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. And it doesn't mean that they're not equipped to heal from it. It's just, sometimes things just come up that you're not prepared to deal with. And that's why we do have therapists and mental health providers available for that additional support when you need it.
I really appreciate you talking about that, because I think so often we think it's one and done. Okay, I've done it. I've healed. My child is doing well. They're back in school. Everything's good. Let's just get on with life. And
Right.
people are often like confused that they will probably need at some other point in their life to process some other things as they grow mentally, their
Mm-hmm.
understanding of what happened, or how it, like you said, if you repress all those feelings or memories and all of a sudden they start coming to the surface, rage and irritation and depression and anxiety and super stress,
Mm-hmm.
those are all things that that I've experienced, and that I realized, throughout my life, that I was pushing back against something that happened to me, that I was out of control,
Yeah.
and not knowing that that's what it was at that moment. I was like, wait, I'm 40 something years old. What am I doing? Why am I, burning down my life?
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm like, oh, I think I'm trying to act like a 12, 13, 14-year-old because I didn't get to do that or something. And
Mm.
that's mostly what I said to myself, and started reading more books, found a new therapist, and did EMDR at that point, and some other things that I realized, oh, there's more to be done. And you have to do the work of healing. That's what is, we get to decide what the rest of our life will be, or we can just go down the rabbit hole of being a victim. And that doesn't work for a happy life anyway. Do you have any cases like that where you really worked with somebody and they just couldn't get out of victim mode, or they just couldn't come to that place of, I'm going to let go? They don't even have to say the word forgive, but somehow you kind of have to let go, at least, in order for you to move forward, so that you're not
Mm.
in the prison,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what
Mm-hmm.
I kind of sometimes compare forgiveness to. I'm like, it's letting you out of the cage. You're in the bird cage until you can forgive or let go. That doesn't mean the person that perpetrated shouldn't go to jail or gets a free
Right.
pass. That's not what I'm saying, but there is something like that. And then changing that mental attitude of, from a victim to a survivor, and from a survivor to somebody who can thrive and heal. I don't
Absolutely.
know, just maybe a case or two where you've really struggled with that one, because I think that's a hard one for people, especially if it's generational, like generational trauma that's gone on and on and on for years and generations. You kind of get, I don't know if bitter is the right word, or
Mm-hmm.
just like, this is how life
Resentful.
is, or
Yeah.
I'm not sure what that is, but it feels like, yeah, resentful. That's a
Mm-hmm.
good word. Yeah,
Yeah.
talk about that to our audience a little bit, if there's any cases you could, speak of, or how
Yeah.
you get out of that victim mindset.
Oh, definitely. So I've done a lot of work within the last 3 years with this guy's name is Robert Marshall, who is a pastor who was a victim of sexual trauma. He had multiple abusers through the church, and we got connected like 2019, and he was on a journey of his own healing, and he was connecting with mental health professionals who had specialty in this, and also other Black men who also experienced sexual trauma. And he creates these spaces where men can come together to share their experiences and get healing. So I
Mm.
had my experience working with victims of sexual trauma has been very interesting because I've seen it on all different age levels. I've worked with very young children, and I always wondered, like, how did these children turn out as men? And I'll say within the last 3 or 4 years, I've worked with a lot of men in my practice and through this group that he created is called the Survival Circle. So occasionally I'll go speak on a panel, or we'll do a group discussion. And what's very interesting is a lot of the men will kind of say the same thing. The way that they got out of this mindset of being a victim and being able to kind of move forward with life was being able to forgive themselves, and being able to forgive their perpetrator. And because a lot of times we're waiting for an apology that probably will never happen. We're waiting for some type of acknowledgement from that person that abused us, that, you know, I'm sorry. This was, I did not want to hurt you. This wasn't okay. I made a mistake. And that might not ever happen. And the forgiveness is not necessarily forgiving them, is like you're forgiving yourself so you can move forward. Because when you continue to wait for that, you're still giving that person power and control over yourself and your emotions. And you're still harboring that resentment and that anger, and it's going to impact the way that you function and move throughout society. The way that it's going to impact the way that you relate to other people. It's going to impact your intimate relationships. It's going to impact the way that you raise your children. So the forgiveness is about yourself and being able to let that go. And I think that is one of the ways that you can help shift your mindset from victimhood to survivor. So that's one of the things I personally learned from working with the men in the survival circle, is being able to forgive and being able to reclaim your body. That's a big piece of it, because their bodies were taken away from them at such a young age. So being able to reclaim their body and yeah, just being able to move forward with life with that renewed mindset.
So renewing your mindset is really the key, because again, what happened in the past isn't happening currently, but it's the effects of, it's like if you have, any kind of a trauma, and it affects your physical body, and the scar may heal, but or the wound may heal, but there's still a scar there, so you have to
Absolutely.
tend to it, and that's what you're saying, and I love that, because I think that if we could get out of that, or get past just continual victim talk in our survivor circles. Like, I think people need to tell their story and really be heard and
Mm-hmm.
seen and believed. I think that's really critical, because for a lot of survivors, that really hasn't happened. Even when they told a loved one who did believe them, that loved one almost overreacts, or they
Mm-hmm.
they want to help, they want to fix it, they want to do something right away, and they can't fix it. We're not looking so much for somebody to fix it. We just want to be heard and seen, believed, and to be kind of given the, I don't know, the pat on the back, like, wow, you survived something really, really hard.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing pretty amazing. How can I help? What could I do to support you? Which goes
Absolutely.
back to that, one of those first things that you mentioned. So have you ever had to work with, within your employee, circle, where you're dealing with employees with problems, or in your private practice with teens and children, where you've had to take somebody cleared through the system, and like they've gone to jail? Because almost
Mm-hmm.
every single person that's in my circle, on my community, none of our perpetrators have ever spent a day in jail. They never got, you know, and I'm okay with it now, because I've done so much work on my own, letting go and moving on, but that is still fresh for some people that have tried. They tried to do all the right things and it didn't happen. Their rape kit wasn't enough, and I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
gosh, I didn't have any of that, but because I was a child, and I didn't even start talking about what happened to me until, pretty much years later, as
Mm-hmm.
most people. But I don't know, have you ever had an experience where that has happened, where you've actually been a part of seeing justice served? Because I'm really feeling like justice never gets served to those abuse victims, hardly ever.
Yeah. Usually, what I've seen is I've worked with some cases where they were suing the Catholic Church, the Archdiocese in Chicago. Um, I had a couple clients where they were going through that process, and the lawyers referred the clients that work with me to process through the sexual trauma as they were going through this case. And a lot of time, the abuse happened such a long time ago that the perpetrator is already dead, or they're like, um, the statute of limitations had already passed, and they're like, it happened like 30, 40 years ago, so they can't accuse, they can't they can't go to jail for it anymore. So what happens is they'll be compensated for it. And a lot of times, the clients that I've worked with, while they appreciate the money, they really want that person to be in jail. And they feel like, even after receiving the money, they feel like they're still upset. It's like, I feel like justice wasn't served. I feel like I was given hush money, not to say anything. And like, this is not helping them to heal from the trauma. I have had one instance where justice was actually served, and I was actually working with the perpetrator. It was a middle-aged man who had sexually abused his stepdaughter, and he denied it completely while I was working with him. He's like, no, this didn't happen, which was difficult for me to actually help him work through some of the, because it sounded like he had been abused himself. It was difficult to kind of work with him because he wasn't even able to acknowledge that he did this. So then, like, part of me was wondering, like, did this happen or not? I don't know. I couldn't say for sure. I'm just going based off of what, I was told. And then all of a sudden, 'cause I was doing home based therapy with him, then his communication just completely vanished. I had talked to him in a month. I was trying to call him, email, he wasn't reaching out. And then finally, one of my supervisors said that he got convicted and he was in prison. And she told me, because I think she was working with the stepdaughter, and the stepdaughter had, talked about the extensive sexual abuse that she experienced, and how, everything that she went through. And then I was, okay, yeah, he really did do this, and now he's in jail for it. But that was one of the few instances where I actually saw somebody, while I was in the process of working with them, be in prison for the acts that they committed. But a majority of the time, um, um, it does not happen, unfortunately, for a variety of different reasons, either because it's, I guess, not enough evidence, or the statute of limitations has passed, so they can't convict them. And the person has to just learn how to move forward with life without getting any justice served, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, it really is. And one of the pillars of my foundation that I started is about legislative change and public policy change and awareness for public policies to change. Because I don't think a lot of people realize, like, if somebody robs a bank, they're usually going to be punished. They're usually
Mm-hmm.
going to go to jail or something. And then we have these minor offenses that are ridiculous that people go to jail for. And I'm like, where's all the perpetrators? And it's not usually one child. There's usually
Right.
multiple children. Is
Mm-hmm.
that your experience as well?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
That's what you're
Especially.
seeing as well.
Yeah,
Okay.
especially in institutions of higher power, whether it's um, the church, police departments, Boy Scouts. It just continues to get covered up. A lot of times, these individuals are high status individuals. They have a lot of power and influence, or a lot of money, and they're not held accountable for their actions. So they just continues to cascade into more victims, unfortunately.
Yeah, I really believe that that's probably the biggest problem, is that those that have that high profile are already such shiny objects.
Hmm.
they look a certain way. They have a veneer
Right.
of being one way. And yet, once you have, like, I know of 7 of us that were perpetrated from around the age of 9 to about the age of 15 or 16. I know you know, I, there's 6 other people
Hmm.
and myself that I know the names of, that I actually have read police reports with my same perpetrator, my same, and I have started calling a pedophile a criminal pedophile, meaning the pedophile who is acting on the impulses.
Mm.
And that, and I don't know if pedophilia is more, I've studied it to some degree, but this is going to a question I'd like to ask you about. If it's, I always have in the back of my mind, because I like the world to make sense, that something happened to them. I'm that forgiving.
Hmm.
I'm like, I'm sorry something happened to them. However, once you are an adult, you have to figure out how to do the right things to kids.
Absolutely.
I totally understand an older sibling or cousin, what happens, or a step, brother or sister, or I get that, that usually something's happened to them and they need treatment. They
Hmm.
definitely need treatment. Have you ever had anybody admit to like in your time working with both adults and children, a perpetrator that has said, I'm admitting to having done this or having ideation about this or anything, and then been able to help them mitigate maybe through whatever they needed to heal from, so that that wasn't going to be their lifelong quest? Because for my perpetrator, it was lifelong. He
Yeah.
did this from the time he was, you know, in his 20s until he died and killed himself
Wow.
at 71, I think is how old he was.
Wow. That's a really great question because I have not personally experienced that as a therapist where somebody was willing to admit or acknowledge that they had some pedophilia ideation and they like real or they've actually enacted this on a minor and wanted to receive treatment for it, because I think there's a lot of shame surrounding that, even having the thoughts of wanting to abuse a minor. I think there's so much shame around that, and there's not I don't think there's like support in place or safe spaces in place for people to even openly admit that and then not be seen as like this sick individual, as this predator, even if they haven't enacted it. So I've never experienced somebody um, acknowledge it, before they had been accused of it. That's an interesting question. I think there needs to be more support for those individuals to receive help before they start to enact their ideation. And I think that can help prevent a lot of sexual abuse from happening.
Yeah, I kind of have that same feeling. I know there's a place in Germany because I was interviewed on another show, Andrew Gold, who had done quite an extensive amount of research and had actually gone to try to talk to some of the clients who don't tell their real name. They walk into this clinic and they're like, I I have these
Mm,
feelings or these ideas or this ideation, and I haven't acted on it, and I want help. And
yeah.
apparently you can walk in, not tell your real name, and get help. And
Wow.
I think that's really amazing. And as I as I studied up on him and this kind of research, and then listened to one of his podcasts with someone who had been in that clinic, who admitted to having these, this kind of ideation, that was it was so interesting to me. And I think what came out of that for me was, okay, how do we protect the children, the
Hmm.
tweens, the teens, and even the young adults? Because you're 25 years of age or younger, I still consider your mind developing. You're susceptible, more
Hmm.
susceptible to brainwashing, and then to not knowing what to do when assault happens. You're
Absolutely.
just still like, I did something wrong. It's my fault. I don't tell. I don't go get the rape kit. I don't, because you don't, especially kids don't,
Hmm.
and young people. Teenagers are starting to be a little more aware, and young adults a little more aware of consent and various things, but it's still such a problem. And I'm like, okay, so if we were to have a clinic like that, what do you think about this new proposed? There's a proposed something in the legal system in California that is trying to change the word from pedophile to minor attraction. Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing? My gut reaction was like, hell no,
Yeah.
no way. But at
Yeah.
the same time, I'm a person that wants help for everybody, you
Yeah.
know? And yet, how do you trust them? How do you trust that they can be around society and children and tweens and teens and young people and not act this out? Because it is like suffering, the worst thing that can happen to you, and it's with you for
Yeah.
your whole life. Even though I feel like I'm a survivor and I'm thriving and I'm doing really well, it is definitely affected my entire life to some
Yeah.
degree.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
I don't know. What do you think about that minor attraction idea?
Yeah, I've never heard of this until now. Thank you for bringing that up, Jan. But I can see the reason why they would want to make that change is I think pedophilia, being a pedophile, has such a stigmatizing title attached to it. And I think people do not want to be labeled as being a pedophile. And I think that's what prevents a lot of people from seeking out help because of it. The minor attraction, I can see kind of the reasoning behind it. It might make people feel more comfortable reaching out for help, and I guess create, I guess, empathy or just spaces for people or support groups for people to receive help for that. But again, to your point, it's like the issue is like once somebody admits to this, are you going to feel safe or comfortable with them being around children? What if they're a teacher? What if they're in a position of power where they're working with children, and you're knowing that they have an attraction to a child? Are you going to feel comfortable leaving them alone with them, knowing this information? So I think I mean, that's a really valid question, and concern, and yeah, I have to chew on that a little bit more. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I just am like, well, how much I mean, I really can. I really did forgive my perpetrator, and I can have empathy to the point that I know what he said about his own childhood. Like that he, had some abuse and that he was always caring for his little sister, and then he'd be able to sleep in the house instead of out in the barn or whatever. I don't even know if any of that was true.
Hmm.
Right? I don't know. He was a pathological liar.
Hmm.
So, you don't even know if it's true. And because they're so masterful at manipulating people and grooming people, you could develop all this empathy for someone, and all the while, it's just a grooming tactic so that you're not suspecting them and they're,
Right.
going to abuse your kid because they're in the clergy at your church, or they're just another congregant in
Right.
your church. They don't
Right.
even have to. That's how ours was, and then he was in a position of leadership too, a Sunday school teacher and all these things. So, of course, you already trust them.
Hmm.
So it's like there's that mask that I'm like, I don't know how because I agree with the idea that if there was a possibility that they could have help and not perpetrate, that would make a huge impact, because the FBI statistic states that 30 to 70 children will be affected by one active pedophile.
Hmm.
30 to 70 kids by one active pedophile.
Wow.
That is a huge number. Because over the course of their life, you're talking one, maybe two children every year. You've got,
Hmm.
one on the back burner and one that you're currently, I mean, it sounds so systematic to me, or just sounds like, oh, I don't know how you can fix this. And yet I just wanted to have this conversation with you because the majority, not all, but the majority of pedophiles, at least identified pedophiles, are men. And so I
Hmm.
don't know.
It's
And
difficult.
I
Yeah.
want there to be a dialogue. I just don't know what the dialogue should look like. Because the way California goes is usually the way the rest of the United States goes eventually.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's a difficult
So,
situation, and I think that's why. Excuse me. I think that's why we haven't really come up with a solution to this problem, because it's so many things that you got to consider. You got to consider, are there going to be services available for this person to receive help?
Claude, in your estimation, what would be 2 or 3 things that you would suggest for men and boys, maybe in particular, but maybe for anyone that is curious about healing from their sexual abuse, trauma, violence, incest, and rape? Those are the things that really do stay with us throughout our lives, even if we don't talk about them, even if we stuff them, even if we try to compartmentalize
Hmm.
them. How could we heal? What would you, if you were talking to one of your clients, what would you tell them to start step 1, 2, and 3?
Well, first, I would let them know, try to give them reassurance that it's okay to ask for help. And I think that's something that a lot of boys have internalized at a young age, that it's not okay to be vulnerable. Vulnerable. It's not okay to ask for help. That there's hope out there, yet you can heal from this. So just reassuring them of that. I think the next thing would be is being able to give yourself some grace and some compassion, and knowing that what you experienced was not your fault, that however you responded in that situation is what you needed, was is what you thought was best for you to be able to survive. um Nobody gave you a playbook on how to manage this situation. Nobody talked to you about how to manage this situation. This was something that was kind of thrown on you, and you had to do whatever was in your power to be able to navigate through it while keeping yourself as safe as possible. So just giving reassurance to young boys of that. And then the last thing that I would say is just learning how to um, take back control over your life and taking back control from your abuser, because your abuser violated you, took control away from your body, led you to believe negative things about yourself that are not true. And in order to completely heal from that, you have to be able to forgive yourself, be able to forgive your abuser, and be able to see yourself as a survivor. You can take back control over your life and be able to heal from this if you're able to do those things.
That's beautifully said, Claude L. King. It has been a real pleasure having you on the podcast today. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for what you do in the world. I know that it can be hard to be around trauma all the time and trying to help other people. What do you do for yourself when you need some self-care? What does Claude do to take care of himself?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, Jan. So I have my own therapist that I meet with um, on a biweekly basis. I need that space, just like everybody else, to talk about the things that I'm stressed out about. I'm not totally healed from all the things that I've experienced throughout my life. And I think that's a common misconception, is that therapists, we have our lives all together and we don't struggle with our mental health as well. So I have my space to be able to talk about how I'm feeling and learn how to deal with stress a little bit better. I'm also a very active individual. I like to work out. I like to exercise. I like to box. I recently got into that maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So just hitting the heavy bag is a really amazing physical release for me. And I like to travel, just kind of escape from the stressors of my life and just be able to go on a vacation somewhere, a beautiful tropical destination, and just be present, just enjoy just nature, eat good food, get massages, just really take care of myself, put myself first. As being a therapist, we're always prioritizing other people's needs, and we have a tendency to neglect ourselves. So me just being able to pour back into myself, ensure that I'm going to be in the best mentally and physically capable space to be able to be there for the people that I serve.
I think that's a great list of self-care things that any of us could do better at, and thank you for sharing them. So the one thing I picked up on is that you are speaking to a great degree because you have personal experience. And I didn't ask you about your childhood. That wasn't what we were going to talk about today. But I do want to acknowledge, and I don't know if it was your childhood or some other traumas or what yours, what it was, but that's interesting that almost every therapist or somebody that works in social services or child advocacy or whatever have experienced something of their own. And at that moment of choice, you go one way or the other. You either go down that rabbit hole over here, or you get serious about helping others and you
Hmm.
make a career of it. That's what you've done. Can you
Absolutely.
share anything with us from your childhood or your youthhood or your young adulthood that might give us a little more insight into why you're in this profession?
Excellent question. So my mom personally struggled with anxiety and depression for a majority of my childhood. She worked as a Chicago public school
Mhm.
teacher in one of the worst neighborhoods in Chicago for 35 plus years. And it impacted her ability to be emotionally present for me. Uh, my mom was very depressed. She would come home from work. Essentially, she would lay in the bed and sleep for the rest of the evening. And as a child, I know this wasn't my mom's intention, but I felt emotionally neglected. And especially as I entered puberty, there was a lot of things that I was dealing with that I did not have. I feel like I didn't have a space to talk about it with anybody. I didn't go see it, talk to a therapist, and I just dealt with everything internally. My dad was emotionally present, but he just worked a lot, so he didn't really get home until 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. My dad's actually a pastor, so I just dealt with a lot of things internally, and I became very angry, very resentful. I felt myself becoming depressed and wanting to distance myself from people. And I just wish I would have had somebody I could have talked to at that time, because a lot of those things that I experienced during puberty really impacted me for the rest of my life. And I'm still kind of working through it myself. Just real specifically, I moved around a lot as a kid. My dad would get appointed to different churches. So I never felt completely stable in one neighborhood. We would go from living in a community that was all white to a community that was all black to a community that's all white. Like we would just move back and forth. So I had a really hard time with my identity. Um, I dealt with a lot of racial trauma as well. And it made me very angry as I didn't have anybody to talk to about this. And it wasn't until I got into grad school and I had a group psychotherapy course. Most of my cohort were women, and we would talk about things that we experienced during our childhood and how it made us feel and how we've kind of worked to overcome it and all of this stuff. And I realized that I had a really huge deficit. And what the deficit was, I wasn't able to identify how I felt. I had become so disconnected, emotionally disconnected from these experiences that I had when I was a child, that when people would ask me how I felt, like in the present day moment, I wasn't able to come up with a feeling word. I would have to think very hard to like identify like how this is making me feel, because I got so used to suppressing things that I experienced growing up. And I was like, if I'm going to be working with people as a therapist and challenging people to tap into that vulnerability and be able to express how things impacted them, then I need to do the work myself. So that's what kind of propelled me to meeting with my own therapist, is I realized I had a lot of work to do.
Oh, thank you for sharing. I think a lot of times we really do, when there's, that emotional vacuum that's not filled, that we don't even know our own feelings.
Mm.
We do you have that empathy? I mean, it seems like you do for yourself now. It seems like you said that in your self-care, that you do give yourself, telling others to give themselves grace. Are you able to do that for yourself?
Oh, definitely. Especially as I become more aware of it. And it's also allowed me to forgive my mom too for things that I was holding against her, because she was doing as best as she could. She was experiencing a lot of vicarious trauma from the community that she was working with at her school. And she was a great mom in
Mm,
terms of her ability to provide for us. And we, had a pretty good life, like never struggle financially or anything. I went to great schools growing up. They instilled a lot of great values in me. Um, but it helped me to have more empathy for my mom, especially within the last couple years since I've become a parent. And I know when I come home from work sometimes and I'm irritable and I have to check myself from taking it out on my son when he's not listening to me. And I was like, this is probably what my mom was going through when she was raising me and my
mm,
sister. And it wasn't intentionally to hurt me. It was
yeah,
just, she was just struggling with her own mental health, and she was just doing as best as she could to manage it while raising two kids. So I've definitely been able to give my
yeah.
mom grace, but then also give myself grace too.
I love that. Oh, well, that's a wonderful way to kind of come to a close on our conversation today. I think at some point I want to have a conversation with several people that I've either had on the on the podcast or that are in my community, and some I have some amazing people in my life that I love, and talk about the trauma of the you mentioned, racial, uh, just the trauma of living with racial inequality, or
Mm-hmm.
I'm not even sure what the right word is really anymore, because I want to say it correctly, but I would love to talk to a group of people that can actually speak to it, so that we understand together what that kind of trauma is like, because
Yeah.
I believe that that also makes an impact on other kinds of trauma
Oh yeah.
and how you process trauma. And
Absolutely.
so it would be a really interesting conversation for me, to have my senior year of high school. I grew up in Pocatello, Idaho, so mostly white, right? Everybody's white, except we had about 6 Black kids in our school, and the one guy, his name was Clarence Griggs. I loved that guy; he was so cute, and he was our student body president,
Hmm.
and I was the senior class president, and I always was like, even then I wasn't, really aware, but I was like, I wonder what that feels like to be such a minority in an all white,
Hmm.
town. It just must be really
It
hard,
it is.
but I
Yeah.
think there's something there about trauma that is also intergenerational. There's a trauma that collectively people are dealing with as well.
Oh
So
man.
anyway,
Yeah.
sometime we'll have to put that together. Yeah, would you be down for
Oh
that,
yeah.
coming
I
back
can speak
and
in
doing a
depth
group?
about that. Like, I have so much to say about that topic. I've done trainings on racial trauma. It's definitely been generational with my grandfather, my dad. My dad, man, he's been through some stuff, and I know it's impacted the way that he's parented me and my sister. But I would love to be a part of that conversation. It's a
Okay.
topic I'm very passionate about.
All right. Good. We're going to do that because I believe awareness is the first step to any kind of healing and prevention. We have to be aware,
Hmm.
and when we are and others become aware, it begins the movement towards how do we actually heal from this trauma so that we're not passing it on. Because there is a
Absolutely.
way to do that. I believe it, even though some people tell me, "Oh, Jan, you're such a Pollyanna. You think you're going to solve, sexual abuse." Well, I'm here to tell you. And I'm like, well, I still am like the starfish, that little starfish you push up, that you pick up off the beach and throw out into the water. Okay, maybe it's not very many, but if we can do anything to
Hmm.
make it better for some of us and some of our, children and those around us, our friends and our family members, then I want to do that. And I appreciate you being a part of this movement, a part of the podcast. Thank you, Claude. I really, really am grateful we had this conversation today.
Thank you for inviting me and giving me this platform to speak. And I really admire your bravery and the work that you are doing, Jan, because this is a topic that is very stigmatizing that a lot of people don't feel comfortable talking about. But that is how we heal and grow from this, is having people like you who have directly experienced sexual trauma, being able to speak up and advocate and encourage other people to start to acknowledge and deal with their own trauma. So I appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thank you.